you touched upon the fact that the term emptiness itself, and then a better word might be freedom. So similarly, the next question that I have for Doctor is the word contentment. In Cheke, the term is chokshe. Do you feel, given your vast learning and experience, that the English term contentment properly encapsulates what the term chokshe is supposed to mean?
And I don't think it's not a bad term. Contentment is good. You know, you can say contentment is the greatest treasure.
And then now, Doctor, if Doctor would be so kind as to elaborate on the chokshe.
Contentment is the greatest treasure. Like, you know, you can be a multi-billionaire like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or some of these recent billionaires and be very discontent because you only have 1 billion and some other guy has 50 billion. And then you're just like, I got to have more billion, and then you're paranoid to lose your billion and all this. So they say rightly that contentment is the best treasure because you're sort of rich when you're content. And you can be poor with a lot of money or a lot of wealth when you're discontent. So the point is we can meditate and contemplate. That's just, again, Buddhist psychology, about being content with whatever we have, you know, and that's very good to do. On the other hand, we don't want to become totally complacent. We don't want to live in filth or something just because we're passive. You know, people wrongly might think being content is to be sort of apathetic, but that's not, of course, true. Contentment just means to be satisfied with where it is, and then you move from that basis where, well, you want to be creative and do some more thing, that's okay, but you're not crazed about it. Like, actually, contentment would be the antidote of industrial pollution. The global warming is created by endless quest for infinite wealth by everybody and never being content, and therefore they run the planet, we're running the planet into the ground. So if people were more content with the more simple things in life, they wouldn't work all the time, they wouldn't produce, they wouldn't make so much factory, wouldn't need so much energy, and there would be enough to go around, you know, there would be enough food to share, enough money to share. So this discontentment is very negative. It's like greed, you know, and so contentment is very important. I want to come back to one other thing about emptiness too, and that is that modern science can help us understand emptiness in some very good ways. And that's why I wanted people, but I am sincere. I'm not saying in my wish and my plea to the Bhutanese Government Education Bureau to revise all the curriculum and really make a serious priority out of it. I'm not saying we should just make everybody into a lam and everybody should be a Buddhist. I don't mean that. Modern science helps. For example, that wall looks like an absolute thing in itself to me because of my ignorance and my tendency to invest it with a self of the wall itself, you know, a substance to this wall. But, you know, modern science tells me that that wall is made of atoms, and those atoms are made of like completely tiny particles that spin around in some super fast way, so it's mostly empty space. And then if I go to the quantum level, even without being a professional quantum person, just go into it in the basic overview of what the quantum is, then I realize that we don't know what that wall is actually, and it is like a wave, a particle. It's a completely interactive field to my sense field, and it's like, so we know that, you know, like, you know, the famous joke about the physicist who would put snowshoes on in his laboratory. And why would he do that? Because his students finally asked him, and they said, "Professor, why are you going around the laboratory with snowshoes? You know, there's not snowing in here, you know." He said, "Well, when I get in the laboratory, I start thinking of matter as made up of atomic particles. And so I'm increasing my chances of not falling through the floor by putting on the snow." Because he went into the mind that sees it on that level, you see. Now, in Buddhism, we have a more radical thing. How did Buddha discover shunyata? By just some theory or by thinking some formulas? No. He discovered shunyata because he developed such a stability of concentration of his mind that he actually got down to the subatomic interactions in his brain and in his optic nerve and in the particles of light that are shattering around amongst the things, reflecting off things and so forth. And he saw through solid objects like Superman. You know, he saw through his seeing through. So he saw through the seeming solidity of his senses. Because in a way, you see me now, they see the screen here, you know, our audience, and their mind is constructing out of light particles that are hitting nerve particles in their nerves, in their brain, and they're organizing all of that with all their ideas and concepts of a television screen and Kungadundab and the professor and whatever, you know, and they're recognizing it all and it's fitting with all their concepts. But if you really stabilize your mind, you get down to what you're actually doing is light particles, photons are hitting your neurons, and even below that at the quantum level, who knows what is going on. It's like really, you know, they get down to what's called the uncertainty principle. They don't know what's going on. So Buddha did that experientially by stabilizing the mind to extreme refinement of concentration, where he literally shattered the atoms. He literally reached quantum reality experientially. And then he reached the realm of perfect freedom as indivisible with perfect relativity. You know, he had what we call, and luckily, apparently, when your experience expands into infinite openness, it's blissful, because the sense of restriction and confinement and limitation is exploded, and there's a feeling of blissful presence everywhere. So we call it, you know, in Tantra, at the most sophisticated level, it's called bliss, void, indivisible, or if people are afraid of void or empty, they can say bliss, freedom, indivisible. Yeah, Detong Yermepa, yeah, we'd say. So that you see, that's just a super subtle level of experience. Now, when Buddha was talking to the early monks and the Brahmins, he didn't really get too much into Dawa and Dawa Chembo, because that would scare them into being connected to things, you know, and they want to escape. So he's just sort of, nirvana is the end of suffering. But obviously the end of suffering is going to be bliss, happiness, the opposite. But he just didn't emphasize that, you know. Yeah, it's like when you go to a concert or you have a marvelous aesthetic experience and you say, wow, I was really blown away. And what you mean is your normal confining sense of sort of discontent and feeling a little creaky and croaky, somehow the music or somehow the dancing or somehow whatever it was, it just blew you away, you know. So, yeah, so in the school system, what I'm trying to say, when people learn basic physics, they have their physics class, you know, like force of gravity, you know, theory of relativity, and then Newtonian things like the apple falls, you know, and they have little balls running up and down, you know, like platforms, you know, in physics classes, you know, and they, you know, they do to learn the mechanics and things like that, right? So at that time, the laws of nature should be taught in a way that they are hypotheses. They're describing what happens on a certain level, but they're not rigid, absolute, fixed things. And that the quantum thing, without going into detail, which is very complicated mathematically, but the quantum thing and string theory and all these kind of things are like, there's an uncertainty about it all. And the uncertainty is very, very important, because the uncertainty principle means that, you know, when you look at things at the most subtle possible level that you can with the aid of like instruments and things, where you expand the power of your senses through instruments. They have to do it through instruments because they can't do it through meditation, because they don't learn that. But they do it through instruments anyway. And when they do, then there's a place where your observation interferes with the objective thing you're observing. So actually there is no absolute objectivity in anything, because when you're trying to really pin down the subatomic event and what happens, whatever looks at it affects it. So because it's related to it. So there's no separate subject and object, and therefore the idea of absolute objectivity is illusory. And that can be learned without too much difficulty right away, where people can learn the laws of mechanics, they can learn gravity, they can learn about electromagnetism, and they can learn how it works technologically, and yet their mind is still open that these laws of nature are not absolute. They are hypothetical, you know, in the words of the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, they are hypothetical rules based on evidence, based on experimental evidence, that account for the results of those experiments so far. But if there's other experiments that show something else, they can be revised. So we've talked about biology and karma, physics and emptiness. Right? Those two things as science things, not as religion things. Okay? So they can fit with the education. Then you brought up literature and the Buddhist literature, just as literature.
Speaking about emptiness and about how the Buddha came to the understanding of emptiness.
Yes.
And the way he came about it was, if I'm not mistaken, doctor was saying meditation.
Yes.
And through his penetrative insight and analytical meditation.
Yes,
so
especially analytical, combined with the one-pointed, deep, laser-like concentration.
Yes. So would it be too early for us to go into the mindfulness, or would doctor like to speak out? Yes. So if doctor could now share with us on mindfulness and meditation, because to just get the ball rolling, to any mind, I think, first of all, when you think about being mindful, is it being mindful in a sense that, okay, I'm right now in Shualing, I'm with Robert Thurman, and two of us are in conversation, and the camera is rolling. Is that mindfulness, or is there more to it in Buddhism?